Season 7 is the worst season of SpongeBob. I don't think this is coming off as a surprise to anyone, but I did not enjoy this season. There were very little episodes that were really good, and the rest of the episodes range from just okay to completely terrible. In fact, I hated some of these episodes when I was 8 years old. Freaking 8! And I still thought The Breadwinners was a really good show. And even that, I'd take that over this. However, to be fair, I wouldn't exactly call this season worthless. It was pretty bad, but at least I could say there were some good standouts. In fact, there are some episodes from the season I would consider underrated. But even with that, they can't really save this season for me. But enough about me ranting on Season 7. Let's take a look at the best and worst of this season. As with most lists, it's all subjective, and why do I even bother at this point? I think you all know the rules by this point. Let's just get the worst list over and done with. A Pal for Gary. Feeling guilty for leaving Gary home alone, not knowing he's fine with it, SpongeBob purchases a dangerous exotic pet to keep Gary company. But once his back is turned, the pet goes ballistic and attempts to kill Gary. He tries to warn SpongeBob of this, but he doesn't believe him. The situation eventually gets worse when the pet becomes a giant monster. Can Gary survive the night with the beast, or will it feast on escargot for dinner? I'm not one to talk about horror movie parodies because I think the horror genre sucks ass. It's not just the fact that I'm scared of them, but even looking into them, they all feel the same. They're just trying to keep the audience's attention with graphic imagery, as well as shock value. With that said, I do think the whole horror aesthetic is probably the best thing about this episode. The whole segment with the creature going berserk had me on my toes. And I also really like the resolution of that part. But everything else about this episode is really unpleasant. For starters, SpongeBob is really unlikable in this episode. Sure, there are signs that SpongeBob really does care for Gary, and I do think his intentions are pretty sweet. But he is completely oblivious to everything else that's happening in front of him. I can understand the first few instances where SpongeBob misunderstood Gary's actions, but then you cut to when he discovers what happened last night, and he still has his suspicions on Gary. Even when he sees him in distress, he's all like,
"You put Fluffy down right now! Bad boy Gary! Bad boy! Bad Gary! Bad!"
What, does he need contacts or something? And it doesn't help either that Gary hasn't done anything to deserve this. If there was a scene where Gary was being a bit disrespectful to SpongeBob's property, then maybe it'd be more justifiable. I mean, he has done that before. Again, I do like part of this episode, but it's just swelled up by all the issues this episode has. It's kind of a shame, because if they did fix the problems, I probably would have liked this episode. I mean, they have made good horror parodies before, but this isn't one of them.
Oh, these enchiladas are hot! Geralt, it is not nice to ignore new friends. Why don't you two play a little? That will help you bond. Great! Now my enchiladas are cold.
Hide and then what happens? In this episode, SpongeBob and Patrick decide to play some hide and seek. But after a few seconds, Patrick decides to go back home, leaving SpongeBob to believe Patrick was still playing and he's hiding. So SpongeBob goes all across Bikini Bottom and beyond to find Patrick. On his journey, he interacts with other people for answers on where he is. This episode is really brain dead. The plot just feels like it meanders and drags out for longer than it should, with almost every joke feeling like a miss in execution. It's kind of the same problem as Choir Boys, really. It's not as abysmal as that dumpster fire, obviously, but it's still pretty bad. I mean, for most of the beginning of the episode, we're just watching SpongeBob explain to Patrick how hide and seek works, and it's not even that funny.
Hey, you're peeking!
I thought you said you didn't know how to play.
Play what?
Hide and seek.
Oh, no, I do! I do know how to play!
Oh, good!
I just have one tiny question.
What's that?
What's hide and seek?
Not to mention the part where we actually see SpongeBob looking for Patrick is really contrived. Usually in hide and seek, the best choice is to look at the obvious places first before looking elsewhere. But if SpongeBob actually did that, the episode would be over entirely. So we actually had to sit through SpongeBob bothering his friends on where Patrick is. This is also unfunny and in some cases, frustrating.
Are you sure you're sure?
Yes.
Are you sure you're sure you're sure?
Yes.
Are you sure you're sure you're sure you're sure?
Yes.
Are you sure you're 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 sure you're
Shut up! You're so annoying.
To be fair, the ending of this episode is actually pretty nice. I do like the message of this episode about having fun, but the process of getting there is extremely tedious. Having a good message doesn't automatically make things good. It's all about how you execute it, and sadly, I feel like this message is just wasted in such a boring and frustrating episode.
Welcome to the end of the world! Cafe and gift shop.
Earworm. SpongeBob becomes invested in a new song playing on the radio, and everyone becomes really annoyed with him singing that annoying song. They warn him to stop singing the song, but it's too late as the song is imprinted into his mind, as he goes mentally insane. You see, SpongeBob has contracted an earworm which constantly keeps playing the song in his head, so it's up to his friends to get rid of the earworm in his head. Here's another episode you might disagree with me on. Much like how Spy Buddies was one of the highlights of Season 5, this episode was one of the highlights of Season 7. In fact, it was one of the few good episodes from this season. But unlike Spy Buddies, I do kinda see the praise of this episode. I hear some people say that they find the episode a bit relatable, but as you can tell, I'm not one of those people. Sure, there are plenty of songs I've heard that did get stuck in my head, but not to a point where I actually felt like singing them, mainly because I'm not really into singing. I prefer just listening to the music rather than just singing along to it. But I think the big issue with this episode is that it's really annoying. Even when I watched this as a kid, I found it really obnoxious. The song in this episode f***ing sucks. It's kind of the same problem I had with Let It Go. But at least with that song, they only played it once or twice in the movie, while everyone else was repeatedly singing it. But even then, I'd take that song over the musical Doodle. Just hearing SpongeBob constantly listen and sing to that song got really irritating. Even when the episode does try to take a breather, it just cuts back to that song because I think it's so funny. I understand everyone really likes this episode, but I'm sorry, I just found it insufferable. Say what you will about this episode, but for me, I'm gonna need to bring out my earplugs. Yours, mine, and mine. In this episode, Patrick decides to buy a Krabby Kitty meal at the Krusty Krab, but is distraught when he discovers it doesn't come with a toy. Complaining to Mr. Krabs, he makes a toy out of a small Krabby Patty. SpongeBob decides to purchase extra for the toy, but since technically the kitty meal was for both him and Patrick, he obviously wants to play with it. SpongeBob decides to share the patty with him, but Patrick starts to get way too attached to it, refusing to let SpongeBob play with it for more than a second. Okay, I actually found this episode to be a bit more relatable. While as a kid I could put others' needs before myself, there were plenty of times where I acted a bit selfish. Mainly with the stuff I had or the stuff I wanted. Maybe even to a point it might have affected my friendships. Doesn't change the fact that this episode could suck a big one. In theory, this episode sounds simple. SpongeBob and Patrick are fighting over a toy and things go haywire. But in execution, it is horrendous. And this all stems onto how Patrick acts in this episode. Even from the get-go, he starts making moves. When SpongeBob suggests buying the Krabby Meal together, Patrick doesn't even contribute to it and just uses SpongeBob's money. And even when he gets the meal, he doesn't even share it. Wasn't that the whole point of the thing? In fact, Patrick acts like he bought the thing for himself, with his own money even.
What? That's a ripoff! I want my money back!
Wow, what a likable character! Oh, but it doesn't stop there, because then Patrick decides to go back on what he thought and abuse the whole sharing thing. Never mind the fact that SpongeBob actually paid extra for the Krabby Meal toy, and now Patrick is using his words against him so he doesn't have the toy! What a great pair of friends! Woohoo! I really hated Patrick in this episode because he acts like a complete asshole for the entirety of it. Oh yeah, did I mention this goes on for the entire episode? Yeah, for 11 minutes, we watch Patrick act like a back to SpongeBob, as he won't even let his best friend play with a toy that he bought for even a millisecond. Talk about character assassination, sheesh! Even as a kid, I wanted so desperately to see SpongeBob actually get more time with a toy. And yet seeing Patrick hoard the thing for himself and even destroy it just because he can't have it? What the f***? I'm sorry if I got a bit out of hand with this episode, but this was just terrible. Nothing about this episode was funny or entertaining, and it took Patrick's character and just steamrolled it all over it. Would I say that it's Patrick's worst episode? Well...
Okay, my final offer. We trade off every second.
1!
1!
1!
Stuck in the ringer. After a complete accident, SpongeBob gets ensnared in his drying ringer, struggling to get out of it. Patrick tries to help SpongeBob, but only makes the situation even worse by gluing him to the ringer. So now SpongeBob is completely stuck inside a ringer and has to deal with it for the rest of his life. He tries to get through his day while inside the ringer, but it ultimately becomes a complete disaster. Okay, who thought this was a good idea? Who on earth thought that this would be a good concept for an episode? Even looking at this in theory, it's stupid. But in execution, it felt like the writers were actually trying to get fired. This entire episode is relentless, unfunny, and even toxic. For most of the episode, we're watching SpongeBob struggle so desperately to get through his day while stuck inside of a ringer. And yet nobody's taking how he feels into consideration. Sure, it makes sense why Krabs berated SpongeBob because he made the situation even worse because he was in the ringer. But yet everyone else calling him out is completely unjustified. On top of that, the humor in this episode is freaking terrible. Though to be fair, the joke with the one customer consistently injuring himself did kind of give me a chuckle. But that's just it. A chuckle. Outside of that, I didn't even crack a smirk once. Because every single joke in this episode revolves around the same gag of, oh look, SpongeBob is constantly getting hurt because the ringer's in the way. It's so hilarious. Coming from a guy who enjoys schadenfreude and laughter at the expense of others, I honestly felt more sorry for SpongeBob than I was amused. Because he's done absolutely nothing to deserve this. In fact, I was actually cheering on SpongeBob when he blew up at Patrick. But speaking of which, I've been saving this for last. This has to be one of, if not Patrick's worst appearance I've ever seen. Seriously, even as a kid, I hated him in this episode. As if making the conflict even worse wasn't bad enough. He doesn't even take how SpongeBob feels into consideration until the very end of the episode. And even then, it feels like he hasn't learned anything. And the fact that the Bikini Bottomites actually shame SpongeBob for blowing up at Patrick is fucking appalling. Because given everything that's happened throughout this episode, SpongeBob was objectively right. In fact, if I was in his shoes, I would have cut in all contact from Patrick and never speak to him ever again. But apparently because he lashed out at Patrick, that makes him heartless and he deserved everything that happened to him. Off! And the resolution of this episode is terrible. You expect me to believe that them crying their eyes out would wash off all the permanent glue? I can't anymore. This is legitimately one of the worst episodes among the ranks of Choir Boys. The characters are all hateable. The jokes are painful to listen to. The story is incredibly contrived and forced. And the messages they attempt to get across are atrocious and toxic. This episode is fucking terrible.
Help! I think you've helped quite enough today.
Okay, if that's how you feel, I won't help you anymore!
And those are my least favorite episodes of Season 7. Thank God. At this point, I don't even know if I want to continue talking about this season, but thankfully, I'll give it there were a few highlights from this season. And I don't know, maybe it'll lighten my mood a bit to talk about the best episodes of this season. So let's just get started with that. Cracked Krabs. Mr. Krabs entered a contest for the most cheapest crustacean in the sea. To try to help in making sure he wins the award, he gets SpongeBob to tag along and teach him his ways of being cheap. But he doesn't really do much of a good job and more hurts his chances of winning than salvaging it. Okay, now this episode is actually pretty funny. For an episode that's mostly about Mr. Krabs being cheap and teaching SpongeBob how to be cheap, the way it's executed is pretty fun and entertaining to watch. It also helps that the other crustaceans crack plenty of funny jokes as well.
Thank you. I'd like to see someone top that. Chintzy McGee!
Thanks for letting me hitch a ride, Krabs. I didn't have to spend a penny on travel.
Snap!
Now, not every joke in this episode lands. In fact, a couple of them resort to lowbrow humor. Plus, I did find SpongeBob's speech to be kind of a bit frustrating. Not quite to a point where it hurts the episode or his character, but it did feel a bit off. But I just gotta say that resolution at the end was freaking hilarious. Like, that was actually a pretty smart move there. This is certainly one of the funnier episodes of the season, and it's kind of a shame that this episode ended up in one of the worst seasons of the show.
Oh! Huh? $1 per footstep?
I can't afford that.
Well, it's ridiculous.
Krusty dogs. After cutting a few Krabby Patties, SpongeBob plays with the leftover meat and eventually makes a hot dog sausage out of it. This new menu item becomes a hit with the customers as this soon puts the Krabby Patty off the menu. Unwilling to let the patties die out, SpongeBob does everything he can to get rid of the Krusty dogs and bring back the Krabby Patties. I think what drew me into this episode was the concept. It's pretty simple, yes, but like I said, simple plots can lead to good episodes. And this is one of those examples. And I think this episode's best attribute is its humor, with each joke or one-liner consistently making me laugh.
Krusty Krab, SpongeBob speaking. Gary, is that you? Gary, I know you're there. I can hear you breathing.
Plus, it is kind of believable that the Krusty dogs would take over the Krabby Patties, since they're not only new, but also expensive. And with them becoming a new hit, it makes sense for Mr. Krabs to just take out the Krabby Patties completely. My one problem, though, is that I feel like the resolution is a bit dumb. Like, how is blowing up one of the Krusty dogs gonna convince everybody that they're a bad thing? I don't know, it just never made sense to me. But even with that, this is still a pretty solid episode. Much like Sandcastles in the Sand and No Hat for Pat, this does feel like something I would expect from the first 5 seasons. Oh, and by the way, for all those people that keep saying that this is a innuendo,
you're not just wrong, you're stupid. Now wait just a minute. And you're ugly, just like your mum.
Enchanted Tiki Dreams. In this episode, Squidward is dealing with his usual days being annoyed by SpongeBob and Patrick. But at one point, he starts to have a mental breakdown and wishes to live in his own world where he can relax in peace and quiet. SpongeBob and Patrick take note of his wish and decide to build a tiki world outside of his house, where he can enjoy himself and his relaxation. Usually the best praise I can give an episode, if I didn't make it clear, is that it feels like something out of the first 3 or 5 seasons. And this is another good example of it. This is because this mostly avoids most of the traits episodes around this era fall victim to. Yes, some of the first few minutes feel like unwarranted Squidward torture, but compared to most of the other instances from this era, this one's a lot tamer. And there's never an out-of-character moment in this episode. SpongeBob and Patrick are their usual idiotic selves, but they do take Squidward's feelings into consideration this time, and even consider giving Squidward a break. And I think that's where the episode really starts to shine. The world they set up for Squidward is so relaxing, and the song that plays during this part is really calming. That's a good way to describe this episode. It doesn't feel too over the top. Sure, we do get the usual SpongeBob Patrick shenanigans during the first few minutes, but compared to other episodes like Yours, Mine, and Mine, Waiting, The Splinter, Choir Boys, it feels a lot tamer and not so dragged out. There's only one part where it feels like a bit much, but it all eventually does lead to a good payoff. And even when things do go awry, it's completely accidental and SpongeBob and Patrick do take notice of it, whereas in episodes like Cephalopod Lodge, they're completely oblivious to it. All in all, this is a really enjoyable episode, and it's kind of a shame that this episode ended up on one of the worst seasons of the show.
It's delicious. What is it? A smoothie? Remember, Squiddy, just go with it.
The Bad Guy Club for Villains. In this episode, SpongeBob comes across a lost episode of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. He shows it to Patrick and they decide to watch it together. This episode follows Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy infiltrating the meeting with their greatest rivals and stopping whatever evil planning they're planning. This episode doesn't feel like much when you look at it, but like I said, simplicity can be a good thing, and this episode proves exactly my point. Watching this episode really made me wish there was a Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy spinoff. Like, if they're gonna make Patrick the star of his own show, and also make a prequel spinoff that actually retcons most of the series, why not give us a spinoff of the two title heroes? In a way, this episode feels like a love note to the Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy fans. Not only giving us an episode from the golden era of the two heroes, but we also get a callback on their other nemesises. And the episode itself is really entertaining. Again, how do you miss out on such a golden opportunity? But regardless, I still really love this episode. It's funny and entertaining, and the characters are all really cool. If only we could see them make a comeback. One day. One day.
Oh, I'm dreadfully sorry, gentlemen. You must be in the wrong room. This room is reserved for the BGATFBC.
That's funny. I thought it was set aside for the IJLSA.
IJLSA? What in Coral Caverns is that?
Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boys! That's right.
SpongeBob's Last Stand. After hearing word about the superhighway being built to Jellyfish Fields as well as over the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob and Patrick make it their mission to boycott the construction of the highway. But the plan fails as the highway consumes all of Jellyfish Fields, forcing the jellyfish to evacuate their homes and seek refuge in a new area, this being Bikini Bottom. It's up to SpongeBob and everyone else to save their home from the wrath of the jellyfish. Yeah, shocking, I know. Even after all these years, I still really like this episode. I am aware it does have its problems. The environmental message can be a bit on the nose at times, and it's not even executed that well either. I feel like discussing the topic of environmental protection can be tricky, but it's not to say it can't be done. The obvious example would be Dr. Seuss's The Lorax. No, not that one! Hey, get this thing out of here!
With pleasure.
It doesn't really help either that this thing's been done to death. And it also leads to plenty of derivative cliches and moments. So, why is this my number one pick? Simple, I really like this episode despite its notable issues. For starters, the stakes of this episode actually had my intrigue. I thought Plankton's plan was a win-win. Not only would it put the Krusty Krab out of business, but it would also have hundreds of supporters. And this led to Mr. Krabs almost giving the secret formula to him. Again, the environmental aspect does kind of hurt it a bit, but ignoring that, it could be a lot worse. They also do sneak in 2 musical numbers in this episode. The first one's kind of a mixed bag. It's mostly the same lyrics without much variety in the melody. But I did actually like the second song of the episode. It was nice to listen to and the lyrics were kind of fun. On top of that, I found the humor in this episode to be pretty top notch, with the majority of the jokes really sticking the landing.
They left us in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, this isn't the middle of nowhere. We're actually right on the edge of nowhere.
If it wasn't for the whole environmental message and maybe a few other flaws, I'm certain this would have been on par with some of my favorites from the other seasons. I know, it's far from perfect, but I still really enjoyed it and consider it my favorite episode of Season 7.
I won't let you do it, Plankton. If you're gonna pave over Jellyfish Fields, you're gonna have to pave over me first.
Ooh, your wish is my command, Sponge!
Is that all you got?
So those were my favorite episodes of Season 7. You know, honestly, I'm really glad I'm done with this season, because returning to it really wasn't a pleasant time. But hopefully we can at least go up from here. And I think we might as we enter probably my most underrated season. But until then, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and also hit the notification bell to know when my next video is coming out. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time for the Season 8 list.